My wife knew the account was hers before her own brother ever admitted it. That is where this story starts. Not at the funeral home, not in the parking lot, not with a locksmith standing at my porch with a toolbox and an apologetic look on his face. It starts 11 months earlier, in our sunroom on a Sunday afternoon, when Dorothy set her knitting down in her lap, looked at me over her reading glasses, and said, "Walter, I need you to listen, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." I said, "All right." She didn't tell me about the diagnosis that day that came 2.5 weeks later, and only confirmed what she'd already quietly understood in her own body. What she told me that Sunday was about her brother's daughter, our niece, and about something she had already started doing regarding her. I sat in that sunroom and listened to every word my wife said, and by the time she finished, I understood that Dorothy, sharpest woman I ever met in 68 years on this earth, had been building something in secret for close to 5 months, not for herself, for me. For the man I was going to become after she was gone, the slower, sadder version of myself she already knew was coming. She built it because she loved me, and because after 41 years of marriage she understood something about grief that I didn't yet understand about myself. It makes a man careless, and careless men get circled by people who are patient enough to wait for it. She was not going to let that happen to me if she had any say in it. And friend, she had a great deal of say in it. I want to tell you about Dorothy before I tell you anything else, because none of what comes later makes sense without her. Dorothy Ann Halloway, born in a small river town in Ohio in 1955, the kind of place she always said didn't need naming, because the town wasn't the point, the people in it were. She was 69 years old when she left this world. She spent 31 years as a school librarian, and if you think that sounds like a quiet, unremarkable job, you didn't know Dorothy. She used to say a library was the only place in a child's life where nobody was grading them for what they were curious about, and she took that responsibility more seriously than most surgeons take an operating table. Kids she'd helped in 1985 wrote her letters in 2015. She retired at 62 and immediately started running a free reading program at the county rec center on Tuesday afternoons because, in her words, retirement is for people who've stopped wondering about things, and I have never once stopped wondering about things. I was married to that woman for 41 years. I want you to sit with what 41 years means. It means she could read the weather changing in my face before I knew a storm was coming. It means she had a fuller picture of me than I had of myself. And it means that when she turned her attention onto a situation involving the people she loved, she saw it the way a librarian sees a whole card catalog at once, not emotional, not paranoid, just organized, patient, watching for the pattern underneath the noise. The pattern she'd been quietly tracking for those 5 months before the sunroom conversation was our niece, Renata. My late brother's only daughter, Dorothy's niece, by marriage. But she loved that girl like her own from the day she was born, because my brother died young, and Dorothy had stepped in the way. Dorothy stepped into everything, fully and without being asked. Renata was 34. She worked in what she called wealth strategy consulting, advising retirees and small business owners on how to structure their money for the future. She was polished. She was quick. She had the specific talent some people have for making you feel grateful they're paying attention to your finances at all. I noticed that talent the first Thanksgiving. She started asking detailed questions about our retirement accounts. I filed it away in the part of my mind where I keep things that aren't yet a problem, but that I don't want to forget either. Dorothy noticed it long before I did. She noticed it the way a librarian notices which book keeps disappearing off the same shelf quietly, patiently, without saying a word, until she was sure. Over those 5 months, and if I'm honest, over nearly 2 years before that, if you count what she'd already been quietly filing away, Dorothy had gathered the following. Renata had asked me, in conversations I'd relayed to Dorothy without understanding what I was handing her, no fewer than 6 separate questions about our house, our savings, the small duplex we owned 2 towns over that brought in modest rental income every month, and a modest inheritance my own mother had left us back in 2009. Every single question dressed up as concern. Every question, in Dorothy's reading of it, something else entirely. And Dorothy had done something I didn't find out about until much later. She'd started talking to her oldest friend, a woman named Ruth Calloway, a retired elder law attorney who'd been practicing for almost 3 decades before she hung it up. Dorothy had been quietly consulting Ruth about our own paperwork for over a year before her diagnosis, Not because anything was wrong yet, just because of what she'd been noticing in the margins. When the diagnosis landed, those conversations with Ruth got a lot more focused, a lot more specific. And Dorothy, who'd been given roughly a year, and who took that news with the same steady composure she brought to everything, sat me down in that sunroom and laid it all out, the questions, the pattern, the months of quiet watching, everything Ruth had helped her put together. And then she told me what the two of them had built. She said, "Walter, I need you to hear what I've already done, and I need you to not argue with a word of it, because I've thought this through more carefully than you're going to have time to before it matters." I said, "Tell me," she told me. "If you're still riding along with me here, do me a favor and hit that like button, because what I'm about to describe is the reason I'm telling this story at all, and I want it landing with as many people as it can reach. Share this with somebody in your life who needs to hear about a woman who spent the last months of her life quietly making sure her husband would be all right after she was gone. And subscribe, because this story only gets heavier from here, and I don't want you missing where it goes." Here is what Dorothy and Ruth had built together. First, a full review of every document that had our names on it. Not dramatic, thorough. The will, the deed on the house, the deed on the duplex, every beneficiary line on every account we had. Ruth went through it line by line and rebuilt what needed rebuilding, so there was no ambiguity anywhere about what belonged to whom and where it was supposed to go. Second, a living trust. The house and the duplex both moved into it. Ruth named as successor trustee, me as trustee for my lifetime. Our son Gabriel, 36 years old, lives out in Colorado, calls his mother every single Sunday without fail his whole life and never once asked her a question about money, named as the eventual beneficiary. Third, and this is the part that still takes the wind out of me every time I think it through, a document Dorothy wrote by hand over 5 months. A complete, dated account of everything she'd observed about Renata. Every question, every conversation Gabriel or I had passed along without thinking twice about it. Every small behavior she'd catalogued over nearly 2 years of quiet watching. She wrote it with a librarian's precision and a mother's plain love, because she understood that this document might be the last and most important thing she ever put together for the people she loved. It wasn't a legal filing. It was something else, something more personal, in some ways heavier than any legal filing could be. A record of what she'd seen, in her own words, dated, signed, and notarized on the final page. She called it, in the plain way she named things her whole life, What I Noticed. She said, "Walter, this paper isn't going to change anything on its own. It isn't a lawsuit, and it isn't an accusation. It's a record, the kind of record that protects a man who's going to be grieving, and therefore slow, right when the people circling him make their move." She said, "I need you to keep it safe. I need you to read it when it's time, and I need you to trust that I saw what I saw." I said, "Dorothy, I have never once doubted what you see." She said, "I know. That's why I'm telling you now, while I still can." We sat in that sunroom a long while after that without talking, the particular kind of quiet that only exists between two people who've spent 4 decades learning each other's silences. Then she said, "Walter, there's one more thing." I said, "Go on." She said, "When it gets close to the end, I'm going to leave something at the hospital. Not now. Closer. I'm going to give it to people there I trust, and I'm going to tell them only you can open it. I need you to not ask me what it is." I looked at my wife. She looked back at me with the eyes of a woman who'd already done her private grieving somewhere I couldn't follow her, and was now fully occupied with making sure the rest of us would be taken care of. I said, "Okay, Dorothy." She said, "Thank you." We didn't speak about it again for 11 months. Not avoidance, there was simply nothing left to say. She'd told me what I needed to know. I'd told her I trusted her. That was the whole conversation, settled. Those 11 months were the best and the worst stretch of my life, in proportions I still can't separate out from each other. The best, because Dorothy was still there, because we still had mornings with coffee on the porch, and evenings with the news on low and Sunday phone calls with Gabriel and the plane, ordinary texture of a life you don't understand the full weight of until you're watching the clock run on it. We drove down to see the Gulf twice, something we'd talked about for years and kept putting off. We flew out to Colorado in the spring and spent 8 days with Gabriel and his wife that I will hold on to for whatever time I've got left. Dorothy finished a scrapbook she'd been putting together for 3 years, every photo of every kid who'd ever come through her reading program, and mailed it to the rec center to keep on the shelf. The worst, because I knew. Every single morning I woke up knowing. You learn to carry that knowing underneath everything else instead of on top of it, present but not always visible, the low hum running under every ordinary day. You learn to hear your life playing over it without letting it drown the music out. Dorothy was better at holding that than I ever was. She was better at most things than I was. Gabriel flew in 4 times over those 11 months. Renata called Dorothy often during that stretch, more often than she ever had before, always with the same warm concern in her voice, always circling, gently, patiently, back to how we were handling everything. Whether we'd gotten our affairs squared away, whether we needed help finding somebody good to talk to about the house. Dorothy was kind to her every single time, kinder than I could have managed. She had the specific grace of a woman who understood that how she treated people in her final months was its own kind of record, and she wasn't going to let anything compromise that record, not even the satisfaction of letting Renata know what she already knew. I listened to those calls from the next room more than once. I heard the same careful questions, dressed up in new sentences. I filed them next to what Dorothy had already filed, and I said nothing, because she'd asked me to say nothing, and I trusted my wife further than I trusted my own temper. In the final weeks, Dorothy was at Meridian General. Good hospital, good people working there. She'd been in and out enough in the months before that a handful of the nurses knew her by name, and she knew them the same way she knew everybody by their actual names and by what mattered to them. I was there every day, morning through evening, until she'd send me home to sleep in an actual bed, and I'd go home and not sleep in it, and come back at first light. On the day she passed, I'd been at her bedside since 6 that morning. Gabriel had flown in 3 days earlier and hadn't left the building. Renata came by twice that final week, sat with Dorothy for a while each time, held her hand, said all the tender things you'd expect a loving niece to say. Dorothy passed a little after 2 in the afternoon, on a Wednesday in October. I'm not going to walk you through those particular minutes. They belong to me, and to Gabriel, and to the woman who spent 31 years handing books to kids who needed somewhere quiet to be curious, and I'm not putting those minutes in this story. What belongs in this story is what happened after I walked back inside. I sat out in the parking lot of Meridian General for close to an hour. I couldn't tell you exactly what I was doing out there. I wasn't crying, though I'd already done plenty of that. I wasn't thinking in any kind of order. I was just sitting behind the wheel, the way a man sits when the shape of his whole life has changed, and he needs a minute before he tries to operate inside the new one. An hour, give or take. Then I went back in to collect Dorothy's things. The hallway outside her room had that particular hush of a space recently cleared out, the equipment gone. The door standing half open, the after feeling of a room that used to be one thing, and was now just another empty room. 2 nurses stood down by the station, talking low. Nurses always talk low, but something about how they were standing, leaning in close on something that mattered, made me actually look at them. One of them caught my eye and went pale. Not the ordinary pale of somebody embarrassed, but the specific pale of somebody who'd been waiting on something and just realized it had finally shown up, and she wasn't sure she was ready. The other one turned. She looked at me, straightened her shoulders the way people do right before they follow through on something they've been rehearsing, and walked over. She said, "Mr. Holloway, I am so very sorry for your loss. I'm Nurse Priya. I was one of your wife's nurses these last couple of weeks." I said, "I remember you." She said, "Sir, 4 days ago your wife asked us to hold something for her. She said if you came back to get her things, we were to hand it over. She was very particular. She said only you could open it." She held out a padded envelope, sealed shut, my name written across the front in Dorothy's handwriting, the same handwriting that had signed 41 years of birthday cards and grocery lists and notes tucked into my lunch. I took it. My hands weren't entirely steady. I said, "Did she say what was in it?" Nurse Priya said she hadn't, just that I'd understand once I opened it, and that it was something she'd been putting together a long while, and she wanted it landing with the right person. I carried that envelope down to the family waiting area at the end of the hall and sat by the window where the last gray light of October was coming through thin. I opened it. Inside was a letter and a small brass key. The letter ran to 5 pages, handwritten, Unmistakably Dorothy's hand, the same slight lean, the same particular loop she put on her lowercase g that had been on every note she'd ever left me since 1983. She started the way she started everything, straight in, no preamble, because in her words, preamble was for people who weren't sure what they meant to say. She wrote, "Walter, if you're reading this, I'm already gone, and you did what I asked. You went back inside. Good. Now stay with me one more minute, because I need to tell you what this key opens and what I need from you next. I won't read you the whole letter. Some of it's just mine. But I'll tell you what matters to this story." She told me about a safe deposit box, number 219, at Union Trust on Chestnut Street. She'd rented it 10 months earlier, 2 weeks after her diagnosis, on a Wednesday morning while I was out at a doctor's appointment of my own. She'd been putting things in it ever since. The key in that envelope opened box 219. And she told me, specifically, plainly, in the way she did everything, what was in it. Updated copies of everything Ruth had drawn up, the full trust, every beneficiary designation, a copy of what I noticed, the document she'd written over 5 months, signed and notarized. A second letter, addressed to Gabriel, which she asked me to give him when I judged the moment was right, and she trusted I'd know when that was. And one more thing, sealed in its own folder, records Ruth had helped her assemble over the previous 7 months. Bank records, property records, and a specific document cross-referencing every question Renata had ever asked with what was publicly available about the finances she'd been describing in those questions. Dorothy had hired, through a referral from Ruth, a forensic accountant named Corinne Alvarez, quietly, paid out of a personal savings account I hadn't fully known the size of, one she'd kept separately since early in our marriage, that she used to call her just-in-case fund. What Corinne found was in that box. I'll tell you what it was in a moment, but first, I want you to sit with what it's like to be in a hospital waiting room in October with 5 pages of your late wife's handwriting and the key to a box she rented 10 months earlier because she was already, even then, thinking ahead to this exact evening. I sat there a long time, not because I was reading slowly, but because I was arriving, piece by piece, at something that took time to fully land. The woman I'd loved for 41 years had spent the last 10 months of her life, all while carrying a terminal diagnosis, with that same steady grace, also quietly doing this. Watching, building, preparing, so that I wouldn't have to face it alone, so the slower, more grief-worn version of me that was coming would still be looked after by the sharper, clearer-eyed version of her that had done the looking ahead. I read the last page of her letter sitting right there in that chair. She'd written, "Walter, you are going to be all right, not right away, but you will be. You know why? Because I spent 41 years making sure you had what you needed, and dying doesn't change my mind about that. The box has everything. Ruth has copies of it all. Gabriel knows about the box I told him 2 weeks ago, because out of the 2 of us kids, he's always been the one who watches the way I watch, and he'll know what to do with what he's given. I love you more than any words I ever handed a child in that library were able to say. You were the best decision I ever made. Be careful, be slow. Read what I noticed before you read anything else. And Walter, please don't let the tomatoes go this year. You always forget to stake them, and you know I won't be there to remind you." I sat in that chair until the light went out of the window completely. Then I drove to the bank. Box 219 was smaller than I expected for everything that was writing on it. That was Dorothy all over. She never used more room than a thing required. When I laid the contents out on the table in the private viewing room the bank gave me, it came to maybe 5 inches of paper representing 10 months of quiet, deliberate love. I read what I noticed first, exactly as she'd asked. Took me the better part of 40 minutes. She'd been watching Renata with a librarian's patience for close to 2 years, and what she'd written down wasn't outrage, and it wasn't accusation. It was documentation. The specific record of a woman who understood that the most dangerous thing in a room is usually the thing working hardest to look harmless. What Corinne, the forensic accountant, had found and laid out in that sealed folder was this. Roughly 14 months earlier, Renata had helped set up what she'd described to Gabriel and me as a family protection account, a joint account with Gabriel's name and mine both listed as authorized parties, framed as a smart, responsible step in case anything happened. The kind of suggestion that sounds thoughtful and reasonable on its face. What that account had actually been doing which neither Gabriel nor I had any idea of, was slowly moving money, not big transfers, careful ones, sized specifically to stay under the kind of amount that triggers a bank's automatic flag out of it and into a separate business account. Corinne traced that business account, with the specific patience forensic accountants have, because money leaves a trail even when somebody's worked hard to keep it faint, back to a consulting firm registered 13 months prior. One owner listed, Renata, which meant the family protection account Renata had talked us into believing was ours had, quietly and steadily, been feeding a business she alone controlled, positioning her, if the question of whose money was whose ever came up later, to have already built the paper trail to argue her side of it. It wasn't outright theft. It was patient positioning, the kind that only works if nobody's looking closely enough, early enough, to notice. I sat at that bank table with Dorothy's documentation spread in front of me, and I thought about every one of those Thanksgiving questions, and I thought about Gabriel saying, more than once, "Renata's just looking out for us, Dad." And I thought about what Dorothy had written at the top of the last page of What I Noticed. Walter, this isn't about punishing anybody. This is about making sure the truth is written down before somebody has a reason to argue with it. Truth is always easier to protect if you establish it before the fight starts, not after. That's the first thing I ever taught a kid who came looking for the right book. It's the first thing I'm teaching you now. I closed the folder. I picked up my phone. I called Gabriel. He picked up on the first ring. He said, "Dad." I said, "I went to the box." He said, "I know. Mom told me you'd go tonight." I said, "She told you about the box." He said, 2 weeks before she passed. She said I'd need somebody to talk to once you'd read it, and she wanted that somebody already knowing. I said, "Gabriel." He said, "I know, Dad, I know." We talked for close to an hour. He told me what his mother had said to him in those last 2 weeks, not about the documents, not about Renata, none of it. About me, about the life the two of us had built, about what he should watch for, and when to speak up, and when to let something play out on its own, and when to step in. Dorothy had briefed our son on how to look after his father like a general. Briefing a trusted officer before a fight she already knew she wouldn't be there for. I didn't feel managed by any of it. I felt loved. There's a difference, and that difference is the whole point. I called Ruth the next morning. She was expecting, the call had been expecting it since the funeral, had already pulled every file. We met at her office that Thursday, 5 days after the hospital. Small woman, 66, reading glasses on a chain. The specific calm of somebody who's spent 30 years in family law and stopped being shocked by people a long time ago without ever going cynical about it. She walked me through everything Dorothy had built, piece by piece. The trust was solid. The paperwork was airtight. What I noticed was preserved exactly the way a notarized document is preserved, permanent, on the record, available if it was ever needed, not before. She said, "Walter, I want to explain something about what your wife asked of me." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "She never once asked me to help her stop what Renata was doing. She was very clear on that. Said it wasn't her place to get in the middle of her nephew's marriage to money troubles, or whatever this turned out to be. What she asked me to do was make sure the truth got written down before anybody had a reason to fight it. A record complete enough that if the day ever came when Gabriel needed to understand what had actually happened, it would be sitting there waiting for him. Not to be used as a weapon, just to be available. She slid one more folder across the desk. "There's one more thing." She left an instruction she didn't put in writing. "Wanted it delivered to you in person," I said. "Tell me," she said. She said to wait 90 days. "Grief makes a man move fast in the wrong direction," she said. "Wait 90 days, and if you still feel the same way after that, then act on it. But let the grief settle first." She said you owed her that much. I sat across from Ruth and thought about the sunroom, and the tomatoes, and 41 years. I said, 90 days. Ruth said, she was very specific. I said, she always was. Those 90 days are the hardest part of this whole story to put into words, because from the outside, they look like nothing at all. A man grieving, thanking people at the service, going back to a house that still had her reading glasses on the side table and her cardigan on the hook by the door. Gabriel stayed 2 weeks after the funeral, cooked, sat with me in the evenings, the way his mother had taught him to sit with somebody, without needing to fill every silence. Renata called often, checking in, gentle as ever, asking how I was managing everything, whether I needed help with the house, whether Ruth had things squared away. I answered her the way Dorothy had shown me, watching in the margins, saying nothing that wasn't true and nothing that gave anything away. I waited. On day 91, I called Gabriel and asked him to fly in alone. He came that Saturday. I made the big breakfast, the one his mother used to make on mornings that called for a little extra fortification. He ate. We talked about nothing in particular for a while. Then I cleared the table and set the folder down on it. I said, "Gabriel, there's something your mother left for you." He said, "What is this?" I said, "Something she spent 10 months building. I'm giving it to you now because she asked me to wait 90 days, and today's day 91, and she was specific, and I respect specific." He said, "Mom left this?" I said, "There's a letter for you in the box at the bank. It's here. Read it first, before we get into anything else." He read it. I sat across from my son and watched him move through his mother's handwriting, watched his face do the things a man's face does when he's reading the last thing his mother is ever going to say to him directly. He read it twice, set it down. He said, "She knew." I said, "For close to 2 years." He said, "She never once said a word to me." I said, "No." He said, "Why not?" I said, "Because she said it wasn't her place to get between you and Renata. She said her place was to write the truth down before anybody could argue with it, and her place was to look after me, and her place was to trust you to do right once you had what you needed to know." He said, "Know about what?" I set Corinne's folder on the table. He read it slow, every page, the account, the transfers, the consulting firm, the pattern, laid out plain. When he finished, he went very still. He said, "Dad, how long have you been sitting on this?" I said, 91 days. He said, "You waited." I said, "Your mother asked me to." He looked at the folder, then at the letter, then at me. He said, "She built all this while she was dying." I said, "She built all this so you'd have it when you were ready, and so I'd be looked after while grief had me too slow to look after myself." Gabriel put both hands flat on the table, the way a man does when he needs something solid under him. He said, "What do I do?" I said, "That part's yours. Ruth's got copies of everything. Whatever you decide, it's all documented. Your mother made sure of that." He said, "What do you think I should do?" I looked at my son. I said, "I think you take that folder to a lawyer of your own choosing. I think you sit Renata down and have an honest conversation with her. And I think you listen very carefully to what she says when she doesn't yet know that you already know." He said, "And after that?" I said, "After that, you'll know what kind of man you're going to be about it, and whatever that is, I'll stand behind you." He looked down at the letter one more time. He said, "She loved you so much." I said, "I know." He said, "She loved Renata too." Even knowing all this, I said, "She loved you first. That's exactly why she wrote it down, instead of burning it." Before I let you go, I want to say something to you directly, because this story was never really about money, and it was never really about Renata. It's about a particular kind of love that doesn't sit quiet and hope a thing works itself out on its own. The kind that does the hard, unglamorous work ahead of time, rents the safe deposit box, hires the accountant, writes 5 months of careful notes in a folder called What I Noticed, hands an envelope to 2 nurses, along with very specific instructions, and a key. If you've got somebody like Dorothy in your life, go tell them what they mean to you today. Not next week. Today. And if you're the one sitting quietly in the margins right now, watching, keeping notes, building something the people you love are going to need long after you're not there to hand it to them yourself, I want you to know that what you're doing has a name, and the name is love, the most complete and demanding kind there is. Dorothy never got to see that box opened, never saw Gabriel read her letter, never got to see what those 90 days led to, or what came after. She built it anyway. That's just who she was. The tomatoes came in fine this year. I staked every last one of them myself. Share this with somebody who needs to hear about a woman who spent her last 10 months protecting the people she loved. Hit that like button for me. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And drop me a comment. Tell me about somebody in your life who built you something you didn't understand the value of until the day you needed it most. I'll see you next time.